Well, welcome. Good afternoon in the UK. Good morning to Professor Lam in America. I'm delighted to introduce this session, Fewer Rules, Better People, Why Discretion Makes for Better Decision Makers. I want to start by thanking our sponsors. We at the FS Club are very lucky to have a range of sponsors who enable us to run these webinar series and range pretty far and wide across economics, technology, finance, and today philosophy. So really looking forward to today's session. If you don't know me, I'm Mike Wardle. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at ZN, and my job today is very much to moderate, but get out of the way quite quickly to allow Professor Lam to give his presentation. The program is quite simple. After my introduction, I'll cover some of the housekeeping in a moment. We'll have a presentation from Professor Lam for maybe 20 minutes, and then there'll be time for Q&A. If you haven't used the GoToWebinar system before, the way to ask a question or make an observation is to find the question tab in the dashboard on your screen, type in your question. That'll be fielded by us during the Q&A session towards the latter part of the webinar. And you can put a question in or make an observation at any point during the session so you don't lose that vital thought. The session is being recorded today, so if you want to go back and refresh your memory, or you have friends and colleagues who might be interested in today's subject, the link to the recording will be up on the website in around 24 hours, and you can share that freely. Final piece of housekeeping, if you do ask a question today, we will pass some contact details to Professor Lam so that if there's any need for follow-up communication, that can be facilitated. But otherwise, we look forward to today's event. Professor Barry Lam is Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. He's also host and producer of Slate's Hi-Phi Nation podcast, a documentary series about the connection between philosophy, law, science, technology, and everyday life. I think it's philosophy through storytelling, Barry. It sums up the podcast pretty well. And we're really looking forward to your presentation. So without any further ado, the floor is yours. Over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Sasha, for working the slides for me. So I want to start by a story, since that's sort of my MO, philosophy through storytelling. So when my daughter was about 7 or so, we started to assign her chores at home so she could learn responsibility and contribute to family life. But because she was so young, not many chores were appropriate for her to do. So we decided that she should empty the dishwasher after the completion of a cycle, something about a 7-year-old can probably accomplish. And at first, this was new and exciting, as it is for a lot of very young children. But pretty soon it turned to, well, a chore. So slowly to this very day, and she's now 12, getting her to do the chore in a timely way is a bit of a fight. We started compensating her with an allowance each time she did it. Well, sometimes she'd let the dishes stack up in the sink because she doesn't empty the dishwasher, and we would use it as a visual reminder of what happens when she failed at her job. Sometimes I just did the chore myself because I was tired of all the dirty dishes in the sink. So the very first chore rule for my daughter Darcy was Darcy empties the dishwasher when the dishes are clean, right? And because of all of these failures, I said, well, let's incentivize her to do it with an allowance. Darcy empties the dishwashers when the dishes are clean, and she'll receive $2 for every load. Thank you, Sasha. After a failure of completion a few times, I decided to start docking her pay, and then that's when arguments started, right? She started asking, well, you never say in your rule when I have to empty the dishwasher. So if I do it a week later, that should count. I should get my allowance. So she rightly pointed out that, the dishwasher takes a couple of hours to complete a cycle. And sometimes after the completion of a cycle, she is at school. And when she's at school, she can't unload it. So the rule then morphed into Darcy empties the dishwasher when the dishes are clean within 2 hours of the completion of a cycle. And then she rightly pointed out, but sometimes you run it overnight. And in the morning when I wake up, although I'm not in school, I have to get ready for school. So I have to add the clause unless it's done overnight, in which case you have until after school to complete the job. Next argument. She says, sometimes after school, I have things like Girl Scouts or after school activities. And that wasn't all. She also started opening the dishwasher, unloading it, unloading about half of the dishes, and then getting distracted, going off and watching TV or going on her iPad or something like that. And that would just leave the dishwasher out in the open without them unloaded. And after trying to dock her pay for that, I had to revise the rule was to after school, unless she has some other activity, and she has to complete it within a reasonable time from starting. What was reasonable? And we started to argue about that. So finally, I just put on a song. I tried to find the longest song I could find. Turned out to be American Pie by Don McLean, which runs about 8 minutes and 42 seconds. And this was what the rule evolved into. Darcy empties the dishwasher for a $2 allowance when the dishes are clean within 2 hours of completion of a cycle, unless the cycle runs overnight, in which case she has until after school to complete the job, unless there is some other scheduled activity, in which case she has until bedtime, and she has to complete the task within 8 minutes and 42 seconds of beginning it, or she will not receive $2. This was one rule in one household governing one single individual. Now scale this up to an organization with 50 people or a country of 50 million. And it's no wonder that rules and laws balloon in length. And as your child grows in your own household, they will be taking up more responsibilities. There will be more chores. There will be more rules. And what will they look like? So, I genuinely had to think about this after this one rule. And I thought, if I were a parent at the end of my child's childhood, say, and this was how I had run my household for every new rule and responsibility, you would have said I failed in some way. Or I messed up. I'm trying to articulate why it is that I would have messed up. Why? Because I actually think that this is how we've decided to organize our most important institutions. I don't know about you in the UK or anywhere else in Europe that you may be coming from or on this webinar, but everything from government, and it's not just government, we have a almost solely private healthcare system, to the way that you have to apply for certain kinds of permitting for building things in your home or your yard, canceling your wireless or mobile phone plan or anything on the internet. The way that I have had been pushed to a kind of overly complex legalistic set of rules for Darcy and the dishwasher is how we've decided that we're going to run our institutions. And I think that the same reason you would have said to me that if I had run my household this way with Darcy, I would have messed up. I think that something has gone wrong. And so today I just want to talk about, let's articulate what it is that's gone wrong, and why did we get there? How did we get there? What are the reasons behind it? And how might we put a stop? Or how might we recognize this march to legalistic rules and hopefully find a way to mitigate it? Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. So the big target of this book that I've just written, Fewer Rules, Better People, is not rules in themselves, but legalism or legalistic rules. The idea that you will have rules of arbitrary complexity to cover a particular case. And when there are loopholes that are discovered, you just add to clauses in those loopholes, and you make enforcement of it mandatory for whoever is the enforcer of rules. So in the case of the household, it's the parent. In the case of criminal laws, it might be the police. In the case of bureaucratic laws, it might be some kind of bureaucrat. There are a couple of problems that I think you can recognize in the case of me and Darcy. The first is quite straightforward. It's something that goes in the literature by the name of the precision paradox. And the precision paradox is just that the more you add clauses to rules, the more you actually create new opportunities for people to find loopholes in those rules and weasel out of them, leading you to have to add just new clauses to rules and new clauses to rules. There are so many examples of playing whack-a-mole with rules for people trying to find exceptions that just don't go with, in the case of Darcy. So, if you look at the tax code, you're going to find a lot of, 9 or 10 different clauses. I actually looked into this for sports, and the sport of basketball. The rule for a foul used to be one line. Something had to do with unnatural touching. And because, various players made arguments that what they did was natural touching or should be okay touching, the foul rules are now 10 pages long with 9 subsections. In the US, the milk industry started, the dairy milk industry started to sue plant-based milk, soy, almond milk, oat milk, and so forth, trying to come up with a rule for what constitutes milk so that they could exclude these other forms of beverages, you might say, from calling them milk, taking away from their market share. And it's actually quite comical because, in the beginning, milk was just a white liquid that you put in coffee and you put in your cereal and so forth. But that kind of rule ruled out sheep's milk and camel's milk. And then it said it had to occur naturally, coming from the mammary glands of a mammal. And it turns out that actually excludes lactose-free milk, because lactose-free milk doesn't come from a mammary gland of a mammal, and so forth. And these kinds of rules, to this day, we don't have a satisfactory definition for milk because of the loopholes that people are finding in that definition. So the precision paradox is one problem with legalism. Those kinds of rules actually don't work. But for me, I think the bigger issue is this issue that I want to indicate with yet another story. And this is the story of a by-the-book bureaucrat. So this is a kind of villain for me in this book. And I'm just going to use one example of this. So I was giving a talk on this subject matter at a university somewhere in the United States. And the host organized a 9 a.m. event. Quite naturally, she wanted coffee for this event and went to go purchase the coffee. And there was a Starbucks. But she needed a pre-approval from an administrator for all catering orders as a rule for this institution. And in the catering rules, it mentioned 2 vendors that you were allowed to use for catering, just 2. And Starbucks wasn't one of those vendors. So if you don't have, if it's not a vendor, then it's not supposed to be approved. And she went to the administrator and said, look, we need coffee. It's 9 a.m. I recognize that Starbucks is not a vendor, but let me show you the receipts from the last event that we did. The vendor that is approved subcontracts out their coffee orders to Starbucks, and to precisely this very Starbucks, which I would like to order coffee. So I know it's a violation of the letter of the law, the letter of the rules, but not its spirit, because look, the reason why this rule exists is because you don't want to be overcharged or you have existing contracts, but we would be getting coffee from Starbucks anyways. And this bureaucrat did not approve the coffee order, so that she had to purchase the coffee out of her own pocket. Very trivial issue, but I think that we all know, if we work in a bureaucracy, that there is a kind of manager who is like that. The by-the-book bureaucrat doesn't like to use their own decision-making ability to skirt the rule, even when that particular rule happens to be, not the correct thing to be applying in a certain circumstance. And this is the kind of thing that I actually think is the problem with the domestic case, the case of me and Darcy. What I really want in my child is not for her to follow the rule. What I really want from her is for her to recognize the reason why she has to empty a dishwasher in a timely way in the household, because an entire chain of labor exists for the smooth functioning of the household that requires her to do that so that the dishes don't get backed up in the sink. And also our work schedules, the work schedules of her parents kind of depend on a certain time being the time that we do our chores. Her participation in the household organization, you might say more generally, our participation in society kind of depends on the cooperation of other people. That's really why the rule exists. And what I want from a child, right, from your child, is for them to develop a kind of judgment, a judgment about when their participation and cooperation in society requires them to do one act and when it requires them to do another act. And sometimes those acts are going to involve not following a rule, and sometimes those acts are going to involve following a rule. The by the book bureaucrat's job is to make sure that catering orders aren't overpaid for instance, but also to help facilitate individuals within the organization to have good events, events where coffee very reasonably should be served. That particular bureaucrat was not doing their job well in following a particular rule to the letter as opposed to the spirit. And that particular bureaucrat did not have the judgment, or at least the ability to make that judgment. And that's a flaw. That's one of the problems. One of the problems with the slide towards legalistic rules is that you create an organization in which everybody is acting what I call for purely legal reasons. That is, they're acting on behalf of rules and afraid of getting in trouble according to the rules. And we actually don't like that. I don't think that as a society we like individuals who walk around acting solely for legal reasons. Rather, we want people to exercise a kind of moral judgment about when a particular kind of interaction with another human being requires you to exercise a rule and when it doesn't. And I'm going to argue more for that in a little bit. So Sasha, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about why organizations tend to slide towards legalism. So we're talking about governments, we're talking about households, we're talking about corporate organizations where rules for employees or rules regarding customers seem to get arbitrarily long and enforcement mandatory, enforcement done by computer systems and drop-down menus and so forth. The reason why I want to do this, and I do this for a couple of chapters in the book, is because I want to give legalism its due. I want to talk about the very good reasons why we resort to rules rather than resort to the judgment of individual human beings. There's plenty in the history of philosophy, both East and West, that talks about this issue. Very briefly, I want to talk about it, and then in order to make an argument against it. So I call these the law of bureau dynamics, kind of play on the laws of to play on the word bureaucracy and the way bureaucracy is involved. Okay, so one of the drivers of legalism and legalistic rules is the issue of scale. So scale is very familiar in an organization of just 5 people or 10 people. You can rely on your judgment about who you hire and each other's judgment kind of informally without resorting to rule books and enforcement and so forth. But as soon as you decide to say franchise, for instance, and that's why I have the McDonald's there. Let's say you want to open a restaurant, not just right in your local town, but in different states, provinces, maybe around the world. Very quickly, you're going to recognize that you want some kind of quality control. And to get that kind of quality control, you're going to want rules. You're going to want a precise statement about what somebody's going to say when a car goes through a drive-through at McDonald's, right? You don't want the person who's entering a McDonald's in Los Angeles to have a very different experience with respect to the food and the service than someone who goes to a McDonald's in Beijing. So You have a list of rules about what they're supposed to say. You have a list of rules about the uniform policy, which I have here. There are 8 clauses to the uniform policy for McDonald's. You have rules about supplying. You have rules about the workflow in the kitchen, and so forth. And you have managers trained to enforce the very same rule book across the entire organization. So scale. The second driver of bureaucracies towards legalism is mistrust. So in the United States, there's actually a law. It's a regulation, but it's also turned into a criminal law because there's in the U.S. every regulation has a corresponding law that says if you violate that regulation, you face up to 6 months in jail. So it's actually criminalized. But there is a law concerning the size of holes in Swiss cheese. It turns out to be between 3/8 and 13/16 of an inch in diameter. And it also has rules about the shape of the holes. They have to be round or oblong to a slight degree. I can actually tell you the entire rule. I have it right in front of me. Why? Why will we have a rule like that? And I could imagine exactly why we have a rule like that. I could see that somebody going into the Swiss cheese business had some kind of way of creating Swiss cheese with much larger holes, so that the customer who ends up buying a piece of cheese has mostly hole and not very much cheese. A kind of way to cheat a customer out of substance. And so you had to create a rule that you could enforce criminally against the cheese grifters out there. Mistrust of the individuals who you govern is one way that you create arbitrary rules of length. So we have noise ordinances that are about 8 clauses long here in Southern California. I actually looked it up. The noise ordinance here is there will be no sound that's greater than 50 decibels between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. as measured by a decibel meter by a peace officer within 5 feet of the property line. Okay, imagine that. So mistrust is one reason you would give an arbitrarily complex rule. But it's also mistrust the other direction. So when those who are governed don't trust those who govern them or enforce rules on them to implement or enforce those rules fairly, then you don't want those rules to be discretionary rules. You want them to be legalistic rules. So let me give you another example. The laws against speeding in the US always have the following structure. 55 miles per hour is the speed limit. And then there's this other rule that says, but never drive faster than it's safe. Never drive faster than it's safe always trumps the other rule. So if it's snowy on a mountain road, then and you drive 55, you can actually get a ticket. That rule is a discretionary rule. That rule was the only speeding rule in certain states between the 1950s and the 1990s. So there were states where the only speed law was never drive faster than it's safe. That rule required individual drivers to use their judgment. And you would have thought that drivers like that. It shows a trust in them by the government. But that rule was challenged not by the government trying to impose more arbitrarily precise rules. That rule was challenged by citizens claiming that there was a tyrannical use of enforcement. So one individual was ticketed for going 85 on a mountain road, and he claimed it was safe. And the highway patrol officer claimed it was not safe. And the only law was never drive faster than it is safe. And the claim was, you, the government, are using your power, hiding behind a vague rule in order to ticket me. And I don't trust you with that judgment. So you create a rule that tells me exactly how fast I can go because I don't trust you. The mistrust goes both ways. The mistrust between the citizen and the enforcer drives the rule towards more precision, and the mistrust between of the citizen from the enforcer. And then one last example is there is mistrust between enforcers. So in the United States, we are coming at the end of a 40-year period of the mistrust of police officers, judges, so much so that Congress or Parliament had to write out what we call mandatory minimum sentences. A mandatory minimum sentence is a sentence for a crime of which the judge has no discretion. That is, if somebody is caught with some, whatever it is, a gram of cocaine or something like that, they get 10 years, no matter what the circumstances are, as determined by a judge. Now, why would we tie the hands of judges to sentence individuals outside of their, not according to their discretion, but according to a rule? That's a kind of mistrust of the judges by legislators. And these are all people who are within governance. So within governance, if you don't trust each other to do your job according to your judgment, then you're going to be creating rules. Okay. Can I have the next slide, please? All right. So where are we? Okay. So 18 minutes. Okay. So this direction towards legalism has very strong justifications in political philosophy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of them before making an argument in the other direction. So the reason why political philosophers are very much in favor of rules, and not just rules, but legalistic rules, in the West, it has to do with the idea of rule of law. So that's Montesquieu on the left. So rule of law is the idea that you should have fairness under law for all. There are no exceptions to laws, not even for the rulers, right? And the reason that we should have this is that it protects us, the citizens, against the arbitrariness of decision makers, right? Consider sports, right? Scoring in sports is not a discretionary, well, in most sports, the sports that where we have balls are not decisions done by referees. That is, there are rules concerning when a certain point is scored, and we would not accept a rule in which referees just had complete discretion in determining, well, I think that scoring that particular goal was, on a degree of 10, 8 degrees difficult. So I'm going to give it 1 point, but another much more difficult goal will be given, 3 points or something like that. We would not like that. We think that it would be an unfair rule. Fairness under rule for all, even if we don't like the rules, is a sort of ideal in a society. Okay, and then the individual you see on the right is Han-Fei, who is one of the founders of Chinese legalism in ancient China. And according to Han-Fei, the reason why we need to have legalism is because of human nature. And it's not that what Hobbes said, that human nature is nasty, brutish, and short. According to Han-Fei, human nature is such that rulers and citizens will always be mediocre. What he meant by that is that you can't depend on the well-functioning of your organization on the quality of individuals, as he put it. Like, think about hiring, right? It could very well be that you hire the best individual for a particular managerial role or a clerical role or anything like that. But do you want the quality of that job to depend solely on whether that person is a good person? Or do you want a set of instructions that tells any person, including the mediocre person, how to do that job? According to Han-Fei, you want the second thing, not the first thing. Because even if you find a good individual, the next individual is going to be less good. You're going to average out to a mediocre individual for your organization or any position in the organization. He applied this to rulers as well. You could have a very good prime minister, right? Followed by a very crappy prime minister who gets, booted out of office after a couple of months. On average, you're going to get a mediocre prime minister. So what do we want? we essentially want a set of rules that kind of determines what a prime minister does. So even the most middling prime minister can do like a decent enough job. And if we don't have that, then we have a recipe for disaster. That's the idea, right? Both of these are the reasons why we need to have legalism, according to these philosophers. Okay, so in the last section, can I have the next slide, please? I'm going to talk about, okay, there really are genuine losses to a legalistic society, and there are gains, as I mentioned with Hi-Phi and Montesquieu. We have competing interests. The interest of fairness and scale and justice, and that humans are mediocre, really militate us in the direction of legalism. But the issue of Darcy and the by-the-book bureaucrat, showing that increase in rules leads to self-defeating rules, right? And it leads to human beings who completely lack the traits we want in human beings, which is the ability to make moral judgments that are exceptions to rules. We lose that as well. So what is the solution? Well, I am not anti-rule, I'm anti-legalistic rule. So my ideas here are, whenever we have rulemaking, or if you're in a position in bureaucracy, you leave room for discretion in those rules. And specifically, you leave room for 3 kinds of discretion. Those kinds are, number 1, selective discretion, or what they call in law enforcement, the ability to have selective enforcement. So consider the rule against shoplifting. So there's a story in my book which I talk about a case. I'm not going to go into it in detail now because of time, but it really is a case of police officers coming up against a shoplifter who is shoplifting to feed a starving sibling, 4-year-old. We might think that most policing is a matter of finding people who do bad and arresting them. But in fact, most policing is about encountering a situation in which there's a conflict between people and trying to resolve that conflict. Maybe that's familiar in Britain, but it's definitely not familiar in the United States. In the United States, the conception of policing that most people have is that police show up with guns drawn, going after a bad guy, right? But the ability to solve problems without the use of force is a major part of policing. Police exercise selective discretion. Most crimes that they come across, like shoplifting, jaywalking, right? Assault between 2 family members, they exercise their judgment and don't arrest individuals and try to have some other kind of resolution. Sometimes it doesn't work out. When it doesn't work out, you get news reports of, wow, the police let a murderer go. That creates a kind of rage in the society, and the implementation of a rule, something like police have no more discretion to let people go, they have to arrest in certain kinds of cases. That turned out to be a policy disaster in the United States, leading to a absolute ballooning of the prison population here. No, we like selective discretion. We like the use of selective enforcement, right? We want police officers to be able to exercise their judgment about whether they can resolve a conflict then and there without the use of handcuffs, the criminal justice system, punitive measures, and force. Can I have the next slide, please? Right. Great. Something else that comes from criminal justice that we want to incorporate into our rulemaking and our rule enforcement. Consider the speed rule, never drive faster than it's safe, and why somebody challenged that, because they didn't want to give too much power to the government to determine what was safe. Well, I actually like never drive faster than it's safe. And I like, so you have a prosecutor here. I like rules like this, right? A person gets hit by a boat off the shores of Maine, another story from the book. And the prosecutor has to decide whether or not that turns out to be a boat manslaughter case. So she looks up the statute in the boat manslaughter, and it has a clause that sounds like this. Did the person in driving the boat act grossly deviantly from the way a reasonable person would have acted under these circumstances? You might think that that's legalese, but it's actually not. It's actually formulated in such a way that requires a prosecutor to make a judgment, and it requires a boat driver to make a judgment. Am I acting not only deviantly from how a reasonable person would drive a boat, but am I acting grossly deviantly, right? These are what I call vague rules. Vague rules leave a lot of room for interpretation. But what they do is they require individuals who are governed by the rules to think about what is grossly deviant? How does a reasonable person drive a boat? And am I acting in such a way that is very far removed from how that would happen? Am I blindfolding myself in driving a boat? Am I drinking 2 bottles of wine before I drive this boat? Is that grossly deviant? And not only am I thinking about whether I'm acting grossly deviantly, I need to think about whether somebody else would make that judgment about me. That's the kind of thing that you have to do if you have interpretive discretion. Last one and I'll be done. Sorry, I'm a little... Okay, adjudicative discretion. The last kind of discretion we have is the ability to take multiple factors into consideration and making a decision about it. So think about somebody who's at the border and has to decide whether to let somebody in or not. The government actually gives you a list of considerations, right? What's their employment situation, housing situation, like maybe 10 different factors. But the rule doesn't tell them that you have to weigh the first one more heavily than the second one. Rather, what it gives the person making the judgment the ability to do is to take all of the factors and just to make a judgment about it. So no algorithmic decision making. Okay, let's just end here, the last slide. So that's my argument, that we need to make rules that have clauses in them where it gives individual enforcers and citizens more discretion rather than less to move away from legalism. Thank you for coming to the webinar. I'll take some questions now.
Well, thank you so much, Barry. It reminded me of the concept we have in English administrative law of reasonableness, where government officials are required to take decisions which are reasonable, by which normally it's interpreted to mean they had good reason for what they did, and they can demonstrate they had a reasoning, they had a rationale, they went through a series of decisions. Graham Elliott's asked a question. He's saying, assuming we accept that micro-regulation causes a box-ticking mentality, how can we wean people off this dependency when perhaps we're not doing enough to engender the required judgment and professionalism to replace it?
I think that there is a fear by the bureaucrats of responsibility, right? And I think that if you add clauses to their jobs and their rules that say, so for that particular bureaucrat who had to approve the coffee order, if there was a clause that says, this person may make exceptions when appropriate. That's it. It's a vague rule, right? Then I think you can have a really good case that you're forcing responsibility on people and requiring them to exercise that responsibility, right? So sometimes administrators hate that. Like, I don't want to be the bad guy or the good guy in a particular circumstance. But I think they need to be. And I think that adding clauses like that so that other people can make an argument with them, say, look, I think you should make an exception in this case. You have the power to do so, even if they don't like it. I think it's an antisocial behavior. And it's and I think it's an anti-moral behavior to say, I would like to hide behind the rule and not have the power to make that decision. I think that's what we should do. I think we should add clauses that give the option and therefore a way to argue that they can make exceptions in particular cases.
Okay. Shane Drinian's asked, to what extent do you think traditions and taboos work in concert with the law and the protection of societal good? Just noting the Roman Republic fell in spite of the laws protecting it because the normalization of violence in the political space and the breaking of taboos for the use of such violence So, how do we get societal norms and the law working together?
You know, if I knew the solution, if I knew the answer to that, I don't know if the United States would be in the position that it is. I mean, essentially, what I think things are happening in the United States are revealing is that it's all about norms and not really about laws. Because as soon as you have somebody who decides, just break the law, what are you going to do about it? I'm actually in the position of law enforcement also, then you're in the realm not of the law anymore. Now you're in the realm of, right, what are what are the norms concerning this, right? We don't actually have the power of law enforcement over the individuals who are charged with enforcing the law. So yeah, how do you align? Um, I think that the what I've been arguing that this whole time is um, even legalistic laws aren't really going to save you, right? At the end of the day, you have to have a class of citizens and you have to have a class of bureaucrats and people in charge who have some kind of ability to exercise moral judgment outside of the realm of the rules, right? And if it turned out that everybody at the Federal Drug Administration or something like that just decided not to cooperate with an individual who wanted to dismantle that organization, they couldn't dismantle it. That's one individual, right? But that's just not how it works. We've had this deference to the structure uh, of law and law enforcement that makes them go, okay, well, I guess we're just all going to leave, and there won't be anybody left to regulate food and drug safety in the United States.
Thank you. Hugh Purser, just wondering whether you would comment a bit further on this question of responsibility or accountability. So the box ticking bureaucrat who doesn't allow the order from Starbucks, giving them discretion makes them potentially responsible. But how do you hold them accountable as well?
Yeah, so I like the idea of um, I mean, I don't think there should be I like the idea of professional organizations. So I actually like the idea of the American Bar Association for lawyers, maybe even having stronger norms of ethics. There are some, like you will be disbarred if you break attorney-client privilege there, right? That's not a law. You can't get arrested for that, right? It's so uh, I think that when people are in positions of responsibility like that, then you have data about the goodness or badness of their decisions over time, right? There's ways of tracking that. I think it just turns out that sociologically, having professional organizations work better than having rule enforcement within an organization, because it just turns out that when we when we are in an organization with our peers, we kind of want to be seen more like virtuous amongst our peers, like doctors organizations, like than we do about the hospital administrators who's overseeing like a doctor, right? So it turns out that there's way less corruption and more kind of ethical behavior in the kind of professions where like the profession, like your peers are kind of know each other and kind of have reputations among each other than it is that when you have somebody higher up, say within your you know corporation, kind of telling you broke a rule.
Got time for one last question, and Tomek Janowski has asked whether there's a role for advanced technology, whether it's AI, machine learning, in helping inform decision making for rules, formulating rules, or for better enforcement.
Yes, I have an entire chapter about AI, and I to make a short answer is inform. Yes, great, right? That's part of data collection. Um, Deferring to AI judgment, very bad. Deferring is a way of codifying, in my view, legalism as an application to decision making. Informing, yes, I absolutely do think that we should have as much information as possible to help people, right? To help the referees of the world make the best decision they can.
Well, thank you so much. Just by way of wrapping up, first of all, again, just to thank our sponsors. We're really grateful for their support in running our webinar series. Looking forward, tomorrow we're launching the 15th edition of the Global Green Finance Index. Wednesday next week, we have a session on Taiwan's AI-driven financial innovation and digital transformation. And looking into May, we've got the 11th edition of the Smart Centres Index coming up. So keep an eye on the website for future editions. Just remains for me to thank you, the audience, for your attendance and for your engagement, your questions today, and to offer a huge thanks to Professor Barry Lam for covering a wide range of thinking about how we manage ourselves in the world. So thank you very much indeed, Barry. We look forward to seeing you again, but for now, thank you very much.